Very much, Susan. We can start. Thank you.
Right. Well, allow me to welcome you all today. I'm going to introduce myself. My name is Susan Ashbrook Harvey. I'm a professor at Brown University, and I work in Byzantine and Syriac Christian traditions. Normally, I attend the Oxford Forum reading group in Eastern Christianity, and I see friendly names and faces around the screen today from people who join us in the other group. Pleasure today of introducing Professor Matthew Milliner, who is a senior fellow of the Oxford Interfaith Forum and also professor of art history at Wheaton College in Illinois. Professor Milliner's career has been notable for crossing surprisingly diverse geographical, historical, religious, ethnic, and cultural milieus, bringing into lively conversation such disparate communities and tradition or unlikely partners as Byzantium and evangelicals, modernism, Surrealism, Indigenous peoples and cultures, T.S. Eliot, G.K. Chesterton, and the United States Senate. In all of these different contexts, the Virgin Mary has run as a constant interlocutor, a leader in her many guises for his work. Her capacious malleability has provided a constant conversation partner. And it is especially wonderful then that Professor Milliner will turn us today to one of the most historically intriguing interfaith encounters, that of the Syriac Church of the East and its missionary monks, who by the 7th century had traveled the Silk Road through Central Asia and into China, establishing a vibrant and long-lasting Christian presence there, and in the process articulating their Christian tradition in terms recognizable to their Taoist and Buddhist neighbors. So it is with great delight and interest that we turn to Professor Milliner's talk today, The Tao of Mary, Images of the Virgin in the Church of the East. And please join me in welcoming Professor Milliner. So we will have Professor Milliner's presentation, and then there will be time for questions and comments at the end of his talk, which you can either type into the chat or raise your hand in the reactions at the bottom of your screen. But now I turn it over to Professor Milliner.
Thank you, Professor Harvey. Thank you, everybody, for being here and for this invitation. And thanks to the Oxford Interfaith Forum. Whether you realize it or not, this paper is as much a popular primer on Christian-Buddhist dialogue as it is a specialized study in the visual culture of the Church of the East. You could even call it the Zen of Mary. And if I mix Buddhism and Taoism together as I speak this afternoon or evening, wherever you may be, it's because of David Hinton's recent revival of the claim that Chan, which we now know as Zen in the United States, is a refinement and extension of Taoism. Indeed, the more Chan is seen at the deep levels essential for awakening, the more Taoist it looks. Now, I know some people might contest that claim, but I am banking on it in this paper to enable me to speak broadly. And it might also, therefore, let me add a more even controversial assertion than what Professor Hinton suggests, that I'm also banking on something that he doesn't mention, and that so few people do, namely that mixed in, as we just heard from Professor Harvey, with early Zen masters were those who allowed Christianity to be the fulfillment of Taoism as well. I'm especially glad that Professor Harvey is here. Oh, gotta jump the slide here, because her work testifies to how important this material is. And also, this is most important, there is a danger that arises when the work of those like her who study the Syriac Christian tradition fails to enter wider public consciousness. For those who don't know, we just heard about them briefly. The Assyrian Church of the East, it's sometimes called, and then it also is known more simply as the Church of the East, sometimes as Nestorian. They would be in the yellow stream at the bottom. I really don't like these charts, but sometimes they're necessary. These are not Eastern Orthodox Christians that we are talking about. And these Christians, my goodness, they sure did get around. As we just heard, that when Buddhism arrived in Tibet, these Christians were there at the same time in Tibet. And because they're connected to the Bishop Nestorius, whose ideas about Mary were condemned at the Council of Ephesus in 431, they're called Nestorian. But to reduce them to that name is an unnecessary, if persistent, insult, because they, of course, also had their devotion to Mary. And as I hope to show, the cost of not knowing about these ancient Christians is quite high. The cost is major failures in interfaith understanding, and that cost is increasingly severe in our globe right now. And I'm grateful for places like the Oxford Interfaith Forum that are trying to reduce that cost and increase that understanding. So with those preliminaries said, let's get to the material. There he is. I hope you know him. I love him. I hope you love him too. He never gets old for me. This is the Cistercian monk Thomas Merton. And he first pointed out that if the philosophy of cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, has driven the cerebral West, then the philosophy of sum ergo cogito, I am, therefore I think, of Zen Buddhism offers a perhaps necessary tonic. This makes the allure of Zen irresistible for many, including Merton. And as countless local American sanghas, that is, Buddhist communities, can testify, Zen is not going away, even if its initial countercultural buzz has dissipated. Now, Christianity is not going away either, of course. And the most instructive analogy I've come across to describe Buddhist Christian discussions in North America in the last 60 years comes from beekeeping. This analogy is not original to me. I cannot find where I first read it. I think it was somewhere in William Johnson. I've got all his books, but nevertheless, it's a great analogy and I'm borrowing it, and I'm going to lead with that today. So I'm told that when you attempt to merge two hives, if newspaper is not judiciously employed, things go horribly wrong, which is to say, when one colony with its own queen encounters another colony with a rival queen, the colonies are launched into total war. Hold on, we've lost. Wait 1 second. It looks like the internet wants to go somewhere. Here we go. Okay, there we go. Total war. All right. But when a newspaper is carefully deposited between the two hives, the competing colonies actually have a chance to get used to one another's pheromones. And this happens as they slowly chew through the newspaper. If both colonies have queens, any attempted merge is still going to be difficult, but at least the newspaper lessens the stress. Now, recent Buddhist-Christian dialogue in this country, it seems clear enough to me, has been lacking newspaper, causing deadly stingers to be unleashed between these two hives. And perhaps the most well-known of these aggravated bees is Alan Watts, whose popularity has been renewed of late thanks to the reissuing of his absolutely mesmerizing talks in podcast form. A young British convert to Buddhism, Watts became the secretary of London's Buddhist Lodge when he was but 16. When the Chicago Buddhist pioneer Ruth Fuller Everett visited the lodge, Watts fell in love with her accompanying daughter Eleanor, which is how Watts found his way to America. Now, Watts never fully submitted to the Zen koan training of Soke-an, who his mother would later marry. But Watts did, in his own words, manage to, quote, fit myself into the Western design of life by taking the role of a Christian minister. And so it was that Watts was able to secure an Episcopal chaplaincy at Northwestern University. The dazzling minister and his young wife Eleanor struggled in their early marriage. And as Monica Furlong carefully relates in her biography, Watts began to sleep with his students and encouraged his wife Eleanor to do the same. Watts was consequently defrocked and promptly moved to the West Coast and soon began to convene houseboat summits with the leading lights of the counterculture, becoming the philosophical entertainer, or these are his words, genuine fake, who continues to win so many admirers today. These are later pictures of Watts. Another issuing of Furlong's biography uses his self-designation as genuine fake, and here gives you a sense of how fascination with Watts has in no way dissipated in our own time. And so it was that the same Watts who wrote Behold the Spirit, a marvelous manifesto of Christian non-duality illuminated by Buddhism, had to repudiate himself. He decried the religion that had the audacity to fire him for his infidelity. In his book, Beyond Theology, Watts gets his revenge on the, quote, uncompromising, ornery, militant, rigorous, imperious, and invincibly self-righteous thing called Christianity. I like to call this Voltaire's écraser l'enfant, crush the evil thing being the church, but this time with a roach clip. Granted, there was yet no such thing as what we would today call engaged or critical Buddhism, at least in America at that time. The famous book, Zen at War, had yet to be published, which might have caused Watts to consider that such militance afflicts all faiths. But even if he had investigated how Zen fueled Japanese imperialism, I imagine Watts would have excused it. The errors of Christianity, Watts concluded, cannot, quote, cannot be shrugged off as temporary distortions or errors. They play an essential part in the Christian way of life, end quote. In short, Watts had determined that the church, the queen of the opposing colony to which he had submitted for 6 years as it provided him a living, had to die. And he stabbed her repeatedly with his pen. Now, whatever one's opinion of Watts' brilliance as a communicator, this, I would submit, is not successful interfaith, interspiritual, interreligious dialogue, nor is it a successful life. I once asked the poet and priest Malcolm Guite what to make of the career of Watts, and Guite replied, he never learned how to be ordinary. And it reminds me of the words of D.T. Suzuki recorded in one of Merton's last books, Zen and the Birds of Appetite. Quote, at the end of Zen training, one finds oneself to be the ordinary Tom, Dick, or Harry that he has been all along. But Alan Watts couldn't just be Alan. As Houston Smith puts it in his autobiography, Watts was the guru of Zen who advised everyone to meditate, but did not bother to do it himself. He was, however, an excellent companion to go drinking with. And the drinking, it saddens me to relate, is what helped lead to Watts's early death. Now, Watts still has influence, but more recently, some delicately placed newspaper appears to be protecting the respective integrity of the Buddhist, the Taoist, the Christian hives. If Father William Johnston was the Jesuit who, over a 50-year career in Japan, navigated the terrain between Christianity and Buddhism most responsibly, he has his own equally responsible successors. They are Christians who have earned the venerable title of Roshi, that is, the senior Zen teacher. We think here of Roshi Robert Kennedy, who pointed out that his own Zen master only hoped to make him, through Zen training, a deeper Christian, imitating the emptiness of Jesus. There's also Roshi Ellen Burks. Rather than trying to say that there is no self, she advises in her book, Embracing the Inconceivable, it is more accurate to say that there is no separate self. Now, more names could be added to this. There is Addison Hodges Hart with his treatment of the ox herder images. There is Paul Knitter with his book on Without Buddha, I Could Not Be a Christian. There's more recently a real workhorse, this extraordinary book, Experiments in Buddhist Christian Encounter by Peter Feldmeyer. What a majesty of a treatise this is. And then there is also the Jesuit priest and Zen master, Father Amasami of the Bodhi-Zendo in South Indian, both a Jesuit and a Zen priest, a Zen master at the same time. And in the adjacent realm of Taoism, there's the California college student Eugene Rose, who worked with Watts but found him unconvincing. Rose studied Chinese with Jimeng Xian, and then Rose became Father Seraphim Rose after he worked with this man. And Rose's insights are most successfully articulated by his disciple, Higher Monk Damascene's book, Christ the Eternal Tao. Now, all of these thinkers that I just mentioned, they don't repudiate. They draw upon Buddhism or Taoism, not just to vindicate Christianity, they draw upon it to tease out Christianity's dormant contemplative dimensions. Now, there are still a few killer bees buzzing around. Christians animated by caricatures of Buddhism and Buddhists, even Zen masters, perpetuating caricatures of Christianity. Now, Merton, in my view, was incredibly careful in his published dialogues about Buddhism. But then there is the Asian journal, leaving some room for doubt. Was Merton privately, at least, some think, convinced of the superiority of Buddhism? And this comes from the experience 8 days before Merton's death by electrocution at Palanarua. Here are his words. Before the reclining Buddha there in Sri Lanka, which Merton approached with feet unshod. Let me read to you his words. The great smiles, huge, yet subtle, filled with every possibility, questioning nothing, knowing everything, rejecting nothing. The peace not of emotional resignation, but of the middle path, of sunyata, of emptiness, that is seen through every question without refutation, without establishing some other argument. Looking at these figures, I was suddenly, almost forcibly, jerked out of my half-tied habitual vision of things, and an inner clearness, clarity, as if exploding from the rocks themselves, became evident, obvious. Here's the weird thing. Same year, Merton had offered counter arguments, very effective ones, to D.T. Suzuki. Oh, jump this off here. And in so both of these come out. Every time someone jumps in, I'm cued to welcome them. Oh, there we go. Gotcha. Okay, it's working. Okay, so these books are published in the same year. Talk about confusion. So you have counter arguments to Suzuki, and then you have this, why do I need counter arguments in the Asian Journal, leaving room for people to say, Merton secretly buzzed off to another hive, right? Now, this is a well-rehearsed question. And for what it's worth, I'm on the side of those who suggest that Merton had indeed settled the affair with Buddhism. His last book was, in fact, on Cistercian monasticism, and all indicators are that he was prepared to live the rest of his life in Gethsemane. If the myth of Merton, the secret Buddhist, endures, it is one that is easily refuted by close attention to his own writing. And the revised version of Jim Forrest's biography is a great place to go in this respect. But what I aim to add to the discussion is the missing newspaper that Merton might have availed himself of. He could have, but didn't. The missing newspaper that none of the books navigating the terrain between Christianity and Buddhism and Taoism mentioned above seem to discuss. Even if this newspaper confirms the trajectory of their interspiritual work. And you know who they are. We've already discussed them. The Christian missionaries to Tang Dynasty China. Here is their famous monument celebrating in 781 that we've already been here for 150 years. This was discovered, of course, in the 16th century. And this is the community that composed the Jesus Sutras, also called the Jingzhao documents. Now, the discoveries of these sutras happened at the Magao caves, thanks to this Taoist priest, also known as the Dunhuang Grotto. It happened in 1907. These manuscripts, this is the cave where they were found, were fought over, were taken all over the world until the Chinese government at last intervened and said, stop taking this. And they have been translated into English since 1951, which breaks my heart. Why haven't people been discussing this when Merton was writing? But a more comprehensive explanation of the Church of the East mission in China, including its architecture and imagery, was only published in 1997 by Martin Palmer. It's a great book, by the way. And the more scholarly critical overview in English, wait for it, last year. It's only finally come to our attention, thanks to the Italian sinologist Matteo Niccolini Zani, The Luminous Way to the East, Text and History of the First Encounter of Christianity with China. We must celebrate this publication, okay? So in addition, fragments of visual culture of this church have only recently been unfurled, thanks to the reopening of the Humboldt Forum in Berlin, where there you can now see them. I saw them just when they opened last summer, appropriately surrounded by an astonishing collection of controversial Buddhist art, controversial because of the acquisition practices. There are the images. There's a tea room where ceremonies take place. And here are the images of the Church of the East. Now, this is the famous one. The hoof above these Palm Sunday processing Christians is, we think, an image perhaps of a donkey with Jesus astride on it for Palm Sunday. Natural enough observation. But isn't it also a reminder of that hoof that the Church of the East named the martyred church in one study because of how much they have suffered, that they were frequently under the imperial hoof of power? That's how I think of that hoof as well. At any rate, perhaps the delayed arrival of all this information accounts for why this hasn't influenced the Buddhist Christian discussions at all. But in the meantime, I'm not sure that what we might call New Age enthusiasm for the Church of the East documents has helped. The editors of one popular edition of the Jesus Sutras, a lapsed Christian and a Jungian disciple of James Hillman, Thomas More, a wonderful writer, they spiked the punch a bit, appealing to those who would be drawn to the popularization of the so-called Gnostic Gospels. The selections they chose from the sutras deliberately omit the parts that sound like an encapsulation of the book of Romans in the New Testament, and hence the parts that might make the Jesus Sutras more appealing to a wider international Christian audience today. And finally, I think it's fair. Many don't want to be duped, right? I don't want to hear some ancient Christian document that turns out to be a forgery. And that's a fair concern. But what we now know, thanks to this fantastic new edition, is that this is no forgery. These are authentic documents. So whatever the reason for their being ignored, I ignored them too. I've written about this. But why did I stop ignoring? I had to give up. I had to give up because I ran out of excuses. Here's why. I met representatives of the Church of the East myself. Many of these contemporary adherents to this communion worship in Chicago, where so many of them have fled following their persecution, their increased militant persecution in the Middle East today. And despite their bishop makes visits here, so I finally went, and despite their demurral about the term Theotokos, Mother of God, they don't like that term. The church where I visited them, here's a picture of it, is named after the Virgin Mary, just a few miles from my house. I was welcomed into their worship. And though baptized outside their communion, guess what? They said, hey, you, why don't you come forward? You're baptized. Why don't you come forward and receive the Eucharist? It seems that even if my mainstream Christian tradition deemed them heretical because of the nuances of Christology, they, who consider Christ to be fully divine as well, didn't return the favor to me. So I want to do a favor for them. Maybe this is an offering of thanks for that gift of communion. And as an art historian, what can I do? I can show how they sufficiently honored the Virgin and did so precisely in their writing and images, even if they didn't use the word Mother of God, which, by the way, too, I happily subscribe to that term myself. Mary, the personification of the church in the Christian tradition, is queen of the Christian hive. And it turns out she happily buzzes in this Eastern Christian honeycomb as well. Is there reason to think that this Church of the East anonymous woman that's at the Humboldt Forum amongst these images is the Virgin Mary? Most would say no, she's just an anonymous Christian woman. But if all are called to Mary's contemplative depths, maybe she's Mary after all. So to show how the Church of the East honors the Virgin, it would be easy to just leap to the account of the Annunciation in the Jesus Sutras. And it's a beautiful one. The Lord of heaven sent the cool winds, the Holy Spirit, to a girl named Mo Yen, Mary. But we can go further than this obvious connection, finding Marian dimensions in the mystical depths of the Jesus Sutras as well. And the one most pregnant for these purposes has been called the Sutra on Mysterious Rest and Joy. Now it dates to 720. And it's been called the Sutra on Returning to Your Original Nature. Now, original nature is a phrase used by the Taoist thinker Chuang Tzu, rendered in this English translation by Merton, to describe our deepest essence, which undue desire alienates us from. And this sutra places that term, going back to the Taoist Chuang Tzu, on the lips of Jesus. It's a daring thing to accomplish. And Martin Palmer, I think quite fairly, sees in this text a counterbalance to the Latin overemphasis on original sin. And it's refreshing, by the way, to see someone make that argument without becoming completely a Pelagian, Augustine's opponent. All right. The title given to the same document, however, by most recently is not the Sutra on Returning to Your Original Nature, but it is most recently called the Book on Profound and Mysterious Blessedness. So whatever the title of this sutra is, let me tell you, it is magnificent. You must read it, because it's staged like the sutras of the Buddha. In the same way that Buddha responds to questions in classic texts like the Lotus Sutra, in this Jesus Sutra, Jesus responds to the questions of Simon Peter. And Jesus sounds like a Zen master advising meditation. Quote, all you have to do is always to practice to live quietly and to put your mind at rest. End quote. But this rest doesn't come without assistance. The sutra also paints an image of a jade forest atop a mountain, an image of enlightenment. But instead of the climber being tasked with scaling this mountain all on his own, Jesus, the true spiritual friend, the sutra calls him, carves a staircase into that mountain, one of the most beautiful images of grace that I've ever read. Which is to say, there's no question here of the Christian confidence in the face of Buddhism and Taoism, even if Christianity is expressed in an undeniably Buddhist and Taoist way. Even the 5 skandhas, the organs of physical and mental perception, that are famously declared to be empty in the Heart Sutra, most famous of the Buddhist sutras perhaps, the 5 skandhas in the Jesus Sutras are declared to have a future when they clothe resurrection bodies. Astonishing move. In fact, as the latest research on the sutras argues, supplanting outdated theories that they were unoriginal, the phrasing is so Buddhist that it can be argued that Buddhism became the vehicle for the entry of Christianity into China. Isn't that astonishing? We have here Christianity expressed in what has been called a Buddhist or a Taoist koine, like Koine Greek, right? You have Koine Buddhism, that any introducing culture has to be modified toward. And I think it's therefore these documents are fitting for the mindfulness Buddhist koine of our own time. Everyone speaks that way. You have to learn to speak that way if your religion is going to be heard. Okay, now, as an evangelical convert in the 90s, I became familiar with the 4 spiritual laws. And the Sutra on Mysterious Rest and Joy contains 4 spiritual laws as well. There are several English translations of these laws that I am aware of, and each of them rendered them, placed on Jesus's lips, differently. Let's walk through them. Palmer's straightforward rendering is no wanting, no doing, no piousness, and no truth. We might call the New Age friendly version, renders it no desire, no action, no virtue, no truth, similar to the 1951 translation. And in the latest translation, Jesus counsels that his disciples should exhibit the absence of desire, absence of mental activity, absence of merit, and absence of realization. Now, the profundity of the sutra's message, however, I think it requires some explanation, and we're going to have to tease out and have some translation selectivity to really tap this. Now, if Merton made his own translation of the Way of Chuang Tzu by comparing English translations with a rudimentary knowledge of Chinese, I'm emboldened to do the same by comparing these and putting these together. And let me tell you, Google Translate cannot help you. You pump that into here, I mean, AI, it can't help. It renders it, oh, no certificate? Are you trying to get a license for a business? It cannot compute. The internet cannot compute this. I love that. And so, but when you look to the Chinese characters themselves, even for a non-Chinese speaker like me, it becomes apparent what these are up to. A negation, wu, of longings, a negation of actions, a negation of, we might call, quantified ethics, and a negation of evidence. So what I want to do is read these 4 laws with the controversies of Western Christianity in mind, and I'm going to make my preferred translation, which is as follows. If I could get it here, here we go. No want, no effort, no merit, and no judgment. And I base that upon the analogies accompanying each of these laws in the Jesus Sutras themselves. So here they are. No want comes with a weak root system. No effort comes with a storm-tossed ship. No merit comes with the fruits of the earth. And finally, no judgment comes with a mirror. But there's another reason for my translation beyond this. See, original sin is unfortunately named in the Christian tradition because there's something more original than sin. The way God made us good in the beginning. We call it original sin only because the original goodness and the warping of that goodness are both inherited, which quite effectively explains our good but garbled collective and individual condition today. As C.S. Lewis says, this isn't good versus bad, but good gone bad. And that's why I think these are the translations we should accept. I prefer no want, because to render this law no desire is to slip into the risk of calling all desire bad, which would be untenable for a text that counsels returning to the original nature. As Augustine himself advises, the answer to lesser desires is not the extinguishing of desire, but desire's transfiguration by a deeper desire for God. And in modern English, moreover, no want is opposed to need, which is why I find it more appropriate. Think of Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Now, next comes no effort, My preferred translation for the second law, this is the exact equivalent on Jesus's lips of the Wu Wei of the Tao Te Ching. To render this phrase no action, however, could be misleading, as the same sutra Jesus advises the right kind of action, doing without doing, he says. And so to translate this no effort abrogates excessive action, unnecessary action, and comes closer to the effortlessness of the Tao Te Ching. Now, my choice to render the third counsel no merit, and you'll see what this has to do with images in a moment, admittedly betrays my hand as a Protestant. But as so many theologians on either side of confessional divides today would argue, Protestantism recovered something universal about Christianity, the Pauline dimension of grace. And especially in light of progress in Protestant Catholic discussions, there's no reason that this insight, this reconciliation can't be fortified by the Church of the East, which in all of the Jesus Sutras constantly inveighs against the accumulation of merit. There's considerable overlap in the Church of the East and Therese of Lisieux, not to mention Luther, Calvin, Cranmer, and Vermiglia. The Church of the East was too forgotten to prevent the schism of the Reformation. But of course, that doesn't mean it can't contribute to the healing of split Christians today. And finally, there's no judgment. Now, to render this no truth, as our New Age translators prefer, is completely at odds with the clarity of the gospel in these documents. To render it no judgment not only accords with the statement of Jesus, don't judge lest you be judged, but corresponds with the analogy that accompanies this dicta in the sutra itself, the mirror, which sees things clearly as they are, without imposing assumptions, projections, prescriptions. In sum, the alternate English translation of these four spiritual laws, I hope, could have the unintended effect of cutting into the original nature that the sutras are trying to defend, hence the reason for my translation. Now let's talk about images. There are so few. There are fugitive images of the Church of the East that are published in the 1951 translation, but I cannot find them. The scholarly trail on these particular images appears to have gone cold. So if you want to find the Virgin Mary, it's very difficult. Now, I have consulted with some experts in this area, and what they have argued is that I can't find them either. So these two gentlemen, I interacted with them about this. I said, can you help me find some Church of the East images of Mary? And they were unable to find it. And so this is very hard. And so the question is, what do we do? There's a temptation to go to images like this, the Chinese Virgin Mary that you'll see on the internet or all over the place. And this recent book, brilliant book, Visions of Salvation, however, says that these 20th century images actually appealed more to Westerners than they did to the Chinese themselves. And so where do we go to find an image of the Virgin Mary? I've got wonderful news for you. One, in fact, survives. And here it is at the Da Chin Pagoda. The Da Chin Pagoda is a church, it's a monastery. We used to think otherwise, but it's been convincingly, in my opinion, proven to be a monastery that is located not far from where the Tao Te Ching was first recited, according to tradition, by Lao Tzu. So it's astonishing that it's right near these translation centers. And inside the Dakin Pagoda, we find that there were monks that were working on translations that were actually giving us, believe it or not, the translations of Buddhist texts. They were assisting with the translation of Buddhist text into Chinese. And so you can't read a Buddhist text today, according to Philip Jenkins, his fantastic introduction, The Lost History of Christianity, without being in debt to these Church of the East Christians. That is an astonishing claim. Inside the church, here is the image of the Virgin Mary. It's on an upper floor of the Dakin Pagoda. Palmer suggests that this image is comparable to Orthodox icons of the Nativity. Mary's bent leg, you see now of course it's destroyed, part of it, but you see the bent leg. Mary's bent leg, for me, reminds me of the Guan Yin's with her famously bent leg. I know there's not a direct connection, but it is kind of beautiful to make that point. And I'd like to bring these two together to move toward our conclusion and fill out the missing details in the Dakin Pagoda with the translation that we just made. The 4 spiritual laws. So here we go. As we've seen in the Jesus Sutras, the phrase no want is illustrated with damaged roots. And isn't it convenient that in this classic Orthodox Russian icon of the Nativity by Andrei Rublev, which is still copied to this day, going back even before Rublev, there is a straggly tree just next to the shepherds. These shepherds might well represent all of us, distracted by too many wants, the weak roots, but they're drawn felicitously enough to the star that can quiet these desires. Next, no effort. The Jesus Sutras use the image to illustrate this dictum of a wind-tossed ship. And I know it's a little bit of a stretch, but in the upper left, the wind-tossed cape of the Magi might call to mind our own ceaseless striving, as directionless sometimes as the wind itself. But the Magi too, of course, have been drawn to the star, mysteriously conceived in Mary's womb by the cool wind, who can give them rest. And next comes no merit. On the bottom left of the icon, famously, is Joseph, who, of course, traditional Christian Orthodoxy and the Church of the East insist had nothing to do with Mary's pregnancy, which is to say, his merit is not involved in salvation, nor is anybody else's. And because of this, he sits to the side. But in this quiet contemplation, the food of the earth springs up nonetheless. There it is next to him. That being precisely the image employed in the Jesus Sutras to illustrate the dictum of no merit. Ironically, a refusal to account for merit leads effortlessly and quite naturally to the most productive deeds of all. The earth gives forth its fruit. And the last counsel on the Sutra of mysterious rest and joy, you will recall, is no judgment. Now, this one gets really cool. We can append this dictum to the midwife in the lower right-hand corner. The water being poured into the vessel to clean the Christ child after birth recalls the mirror that illustrates this counsel in the 8th century text. Salome, the traditional name of that midwife, had to repent of her judgment that no virgin birth was possible. But she can see clearly now. And in the same way, perhaps we too can repent of all our own assumptions, projections, and judgments, even on other religions. And those projections, of course, swirl on the black mirror of our phones, of which this black mirror is an antidote. And then there's Mary herself. She's in the center. Maybe she can represent not only the historical Mary, but the person who's found the meditative rest to which the Jesus Sutras summons us. The depth of the cave there could be many things. The literal place of the Nativity in Bethlehem, but also perhaps the Magao caves where the sutras were found, pictured here, in addition to being the believer's heart, the place of meditation. And Mary here reminds me of the words of D.T. Suzuki. It is out of this zero that all good is formed and all evil is avoided. The zero I speak of is not a mathematical symbol. It is the infinite, a storehouse or womb of all possible goods and values. From her emptiness and ours comes Jesus. who the Jesus Sutras felicitously name the Lord of the primordial void. Finally, we can turn to Merton's epiphany at Polonnaruwa. Perhaps his words, knowing everything, matches to the, let me put them all up there. There we go. Perhaps his words, knowing everything, correspond to the no want of the Jesus Sutras. He tells us he rejected nothing, which corresponds to no effort. His without trying to discredit anyone corresponds to no merit, even if there still remains a proper place for reason and disputation. And his words before the Buddha, questioning nothing, matches the no judgment. I think it matches quite nicely onto the Jesus Sutras. And as for Mary in the cave at the center, it is Merton that describes it best, describing a Buddhist statue. Here it is. The great smiles, huge yet subtle. And there's the, oh, here it is. Hold on, I've got the line here. Inner clearness, clarity, as if exploding from the rocks themselves. Mary and Christ are exploding from these rocks also. Finally, to conclude, I don't swap out the Buddha at Polonnaruwa with Mary in the Nativity because I want to refute Merton. Indeed, Merton said similar things about an icon of the Virgin that was given to him by a friend. He had one. And what he said about it, that there is a spiritual presence and reality about it, a true taboric light, which seems unaccountably to proceed from the heart of the Virgin and Child, as if they had one heart, and which goes out to the whole universe. And believe it or not, there's a small icon that was found on his body and was among his last possessions on his death, listed with the coffin. And on the back of it, he had written the words in Greek from the Philokalia, "Let us present our spirit naked to God." I expect he may have even had this with him on his visit to Polonnaruwa. The Jesus Sutras and the miraculous survival of the Virgin Mary at its monastery confirm what he experienced with that virgin that was in his pocket. The early Christian engagements of Buddhism and Taoism in the Church of the East, at last lifted from obscurity, offer an astonishing vindication, not only of Merton's efforts, but those of the brave explorers who have pioneered relations between Christianity, Buddhism, and Taoism since Merton as well. They also vindicate the efforts of the early Alan Watts. But as the Christian Roshi Ellen Burks explains, interspiritual practice does not erase boundaries, and Merton, of course, agreed. As more Christians intermingle with Buddhists and Taoists, the church, as represented by Mary, the queen of Christian contemplatives, doesn't have to die. It would be equally unnecessary to say that Guan Yin has to die, the Buddhist, the Bodhisattva of compassion. But Mary's smile, if one looks closely at well-written icons of the Nativity, is huge yet subtle as well. I agree completely with Buddhism that cogito ergo sum is a dead end, but equally powerful to the sum ergo cogito of Buddhism is the Christian message, not amo ergo sum, I love therefore I am, but even before that, a simple amatus sum or amata sum, I am loved in masculine or feminine form. That's the message that enveloped the Church of the East missionaries to the Tang Dynasty, and which still envelops the global church today. There must be more buzz about these extraordinary Christians. They certainly love the Virgin. It is fitting that in his Asian journals, Merton writes of a, quote, well-behaved, nonviolent Himalayan bee that landed on him without stinging. He let it crawl on his head to collect sweat for some future electric and gentle honeycomb. Indeed, knowing our Queen lives means that we Christians can share what we have to offer and to fly deeper, far deeper into any other hive as well. Thank you so much for listening, everybody. I deeply appreciate it. I'm going to unshare.
And thank you, Professor Milliner, for this most interesting, lively, and even provocative presentation this afternoon, this evening, wherever we are. We do have a few minutes left for questions or comments from those who've been attending. If you can raise the hand with the reaction button at the bottom of your screen. Yes, Professor Hunter, it's so good to see you here. Thank you. And we are just slightly over our time, so I'm going to abide by the boundaries that are put in front of us. And before one final thank you, I want to announce that this Oxford Forum on Art and Interfaith Contexts will meet again next month on July 10th at the same time. And we will have Professor Ori Soltis from Georgetown University, who had hoped to be with us today. And he will be presenting on sacred signs, how Jewish, Christian, and Muslim visual symbols draw from the same well. It will be chaired by the Reverend Canon Dr. Joanna Collicutt. And with that, I would like to express my own thanks to Professor Milliner, to Thea always for graciously hosting this exchange, and to all of you for your time and attention today. Thank you so very much, all of you, and thank you again.
Thanks for coming, everybody. All right.